Howdy, my name is David, and I'll be walking you through the nature of philosophical ethics today. So, what is ethics? The word ethics comes from the Greek word ethos, which more or less means behavior. So, one way of thinking about ethics is as the study of human action. There are at least three different types of ethics, the first of which is descriptive ethics. Descriptive ethics, as its name suggests, is the descriptive study of how people actually or do in fact behave. So, as we'll see coming up shortly, descriptive ethics is really a matter of factual questions or factual issues. Different kinds of scientists study people's behavior, like psychologists, anthropologists, and sociologists, but we'll be focusing primarily on normative ethics. Normative ethics is the branch of philosophy that examines what a person should or ought to do, and not necessarily what they actually do. Normative refers to a norm or a standard that we place on things, in this case, our behavior. So, normative ethics is the study of what we should do, whether or not we actually go on to do it. And metaethics is a more abstract branch of philosophy which deals with the nature of moral claims. We won't be studying this branch of ethics very much until the end of the course, but an example of the kind of question that a metaethicist might ask as opposed to a normative ethicist would be, how do we know that what we believe about morality or our moral claims is actually true? So there are three or four, depending on how you look at it, types of issues that we will be clarifying and making use of in this class. The first, as I already mentioned, are factual issues, or issues which have to do with matters of fact. Now, it turns out that it's surprisingly difficult to define the nature of a fact, but at the very least, factual issues involve things like, did my vendor offer to pay me a kickback if my company purchased their product? This is something we can ask questions about. This is not anything abstract or conceptual. We just want to know what really happened. The second kind of issue is a conceptual issue, and conceptual issues deal with definitions because concepts, or one way of looking at concepts, is as definitions that we use in our reasoning. So a conceptual issue might involve something like, what's the definition of a bribe? Now, once you have concepts, you have to be able to apply them. So conceptual issues are related to what we'll call application issues, which are questions about whether a concept or a definition applies to something. So we might wonder, what's a bribe in general? Because what we're really wondering is this payment right here a bribe? And finally, moral issues are issues that deal with our moral values, which we will talk a little bit more about shortly. Another question we might have about the bribe, if we've already defined it and figured out that that's what we're dealing with, would be, is it morally wrong to take this bribe? Or is it permissible for me to take this bribe? Those are moral issues. So every ethical way of reasoning depends on certain presuppositions which we accept or reject based on our moral values. So an ethical theory tries to make those values consistent and function as a framework for moral reasoning. So the first ethical theory that we'll be talking about in this class is called ethical egoism. So ethical, in the words ethical egoism, just refers to the idea that we're dealing with a moral or ethical theory. In this class, we use the terms moral and ethical more or less synonymously. Some people think they're different, but we'll use them interchangeably. Ethical egoism is an ethical or moral theory about what makes right things right and wrong things wrong. So ethical egoism is a claim, a moral claim, that it's morally right to care only about oneself. This is contrasted with psychological egoism. As we mentioned in our previous slide, psychological egoism will be a factual question. So some psychologists, some economists, and other social scientists believe that as a matter of fact, they make the empirical or the factual claim that people do actually only care about themselves or primarily about themselves, but not others. You might think of the famous saying that you always have to look out for number one. That view just expresses the idea that we have to look out for number one, which is always self. So, whereas psychological egoism claims that this is how people actually behave and that we can explain people's behavior by taking that into consideration, ethical egoism is the claim that whether or not people actually do act in their own best interest, they really ought to. People should care and act in their own best interest at all times whenever they can. So that would be the difference between the ethical theory and the descriptive or psychological theory. And there are some philosophers who famously have held this kind of seemingly cynical or pessimistic view about human nature, including Hobbes, Sidgwick, and Ayn Rand, who you may or may not have heard of. So just to reiterate, the point of ethical egoism, the moral theory, is not just about appearances, but about justification. It's not about pretending to be or trying to be more selfish than you really are. It's about what makes right things right and wrong things wrong, which in ethics is a term we'll call justification. Why should we do what's right or avoid doing what's wrong? From the ethical egoist perspective, the reason why we should act in these ways is because it benefits ourselves ultimately. An ethical egoist can act in the interest of others, but the reason or justification for their doing so will always be because it directly or indirectly benefits the self. So don't get confused and think that necessarily someone who happens to be an ethical egoist will actually come off as a selfish person. It's more about their reason and motivations for acting, not how that action comes off to other people. Now, the prisoner's dilemma is a thought experiment used by economists and some philosophers to try to bring up a point about ethical egoism, which is that it is not always in one's best interest to act in one's own best interest. We see here a decision matrix, as it's called, outlining the possibilities for a hypothetical criminal duo who get apprehended and are able to either confess or not confess. If neither of them confess, then they will both get 3 years in prison. If one of them confesses but the other doesn't, then the one who confesses will get only 1, and the one who doesn't confess will get 10 years in prison. And if they both confess, then they'll both get booked for 6 years. So it's clearly in the best interest of both parties to not confess, that is, to be true to each other and to not rat the other out. But because of the vast difference in the payoffs, it's far more likely that in their acting in their own self-interest, they'll betray the other and so wind up in prison longer than they needed to be. So this is the point of this thought experiment, is just to show that if it's not necessarily possible or consistent to only try to act in one's own benefit, so to speak, one will sometimes wind up shooting oneself in the foot. So for some people, that might be a problem with the theory of ethical egoism, because if it turns out to defeat our self-interest, then it's not a very good guide for morality. But that's just one way of looking at it. In general, there's an issue which we'll need to clarify again and again, or which you'll need to keep in mind, and that is that for the purposes of philosophical ethics, we say that you can't derive an ought from an is. And this handy slogan is shorthand for saying one can't derive a moral claim from a factual claim. Here's an example of an argument. Let's see if we can determine what's wrong with it. So take as a premise, the Ford F-150 is a large truck that's much less fuel efficient than most ordinary cars. Large trucks that are less fuel efficient than most ordinary cars harm the environment more than those other vehicles, and therefore we conclude the engineer who designed the Ford F-150 acted wrongly. So this argument is invalid, which means that it's problematic from a philosophical perspective. The reason why it's invalid is because the two premises are just factual claims about something which we could verify using science or our senses. So the F-150 is a large truck, it's much less fuel efficient, and so it harms the environment more. Unless we've been given a reason to care about the environment or some other aspect of the truck that we've just read about, we can't go straight to the claim that the engineer who designed the car acted wrongly. Wrongly here is a moral claim, and we have not given any moral reasons for reaching it. We've just given descriptions and then moved on to a conclusion. In order for the argument to be valid, it would have to look something a little more like this. The Ford F-150 is a large truck that's much less fuel efficient than most ordinary cars. Large trucks that are less fuel efficient than most ordinary cars harm the environment than those of other vehicles. And if a vehicle harms the environment more than other vehicles, then the person who designed the vehicle, acted wrongly. So this gives us a moral reason, or at least a reason that's couched in moral language. It's still a pretty weak argument because we would need further reasons for thinking this premise, the last purple one. But as long as we at least give some moral reason, then the argument can be valid, even if it's particularly weak. So we get the idea of not deriving an ought from an is from David Hume, a Scottish philosopher who wrote in 1739. And the idea of no ought from an is as a slogan just means every moral conclusion requires or demands at least one moral premise or moral reason. And another way of saying this is that every moral claim requires the assumption of at least one moral value or axiom. This is just a quote from David Hume's work, in where he draws our attention to the fact that people often confuse is questions with ought questions. In other words, they confuse descriptions with moral arguments. So as another example of trying to derive an ought from an is take as a premise in an argument, according to the Second Amendment of the US Constitution, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. One conclusion someone might reach is that, therefore, everyone has a moral right to keep and bear arms. As you can probably guess, this argument is invalid because even though it's true that the US Constitution says this, unless you believe that the US Constitution is a particularly infallible guide to morality, this isn't a moral argument. It's still just a legal argument. So we may have US citizens may have, under the US Constitution, the right to keep and bear arms. This does not mean that morally everybody does. In order to make this a valid moral argument, you would need a bit more. So, for instance, it would need to look something like this. According to the Second Amendment of the Constitution, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And one reason you might give linking up the legality to the morality would be if the Constitution states that some legal right shall not be infringed, then everyone has a moral right to that right that shall not be infringed. And so that's one way you could conclude that everyone has a moral right to keep and bear arms. Again, it's a pretty weak argument, but at least it doesn't derive a moral claim from a purely descriptive claim. This brings to our attention, as you can probably guess, that there's a difference between ethics and the law. Of course, in this class, you'll be learning a good deal about the laws that do apply to engineering students and engineers, rather professional engineers. But we'll also be interested in the moral arguments behind some of these laws, and in general, the moral claims independent of the legal arguments and the applicable laws. So there is a difference. As an experiment, you can think about, just try to imagine something which might be unethical based on some view, but not necessarily illegal. So you can think about something that's both unethical and illegal, or it's something that's illegal but not unethical. And of course, you think about it from egoistic terms to practice with the theory we just learned, or you can just think about your own perspective and things you might think are either ethical or unethical, but not legal or illegal. And take some time to do this, perhaps in your groups. And be sure to read your textbooks in preparation for your recitations and for Friday. Thanks and gig 'em.